Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Hallie Swanson. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. And today I'm here as the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies' Graduate Fellow. So today we're going to be looking at MS Codex 1958. And it's a bound collection of two collections of what's called Insha, which basically just means correspondence in Persian from 19th century India. And this actually came to the Kislak Center from a former librarian at Penn, Pushkar Sohini, who got it in India and donated it in 2016. But it's actually quite old. So what I want to kind of talk through today is a few peculiar features of this kind of genre of like scribal writing, and also talk about the fact that this is a kind of composite codex that's been bound together, and what actually looking at the object can tell us about in what order things happened to it. So I thought we'd just start off with the front cover. So you can see that there's kind of water damage in this top right corner that you're going to see on every page that we turn. And so it's, you can see it's not in the best shape. We look at the spine in a second, but it was leather on the spine here and in these corners. And then otherwise, this is just pasteboard with a bit of paper on top. So not a super elaborate cover, not one of those like tooled, gilded leather bindings that you might see of kind of finer Islamic manuscripts. This one is relatively cheap and cheerful, and I think that's because it was a manual. People were kind of using it for reference. It wasn't necessarily like a fine object of consumption. You can see that there's a good amount of worm damage kind of here, and you can see when we turn the pages that they've kind of eaten through. All right, what did I want to say? The paper is laid over the pasteboard here. And if we turn to the spine, I'm just going to kind of point it at the camera. Is that coming up? Yeah, here we go. You can kind of see that the spine is cracked and it's missing bits and pieces. And that actually means that you can see the lining here. So you can see the kind of way that this underpiece here has been woven. And you can see the collection of quires here as well, which is kind of fun because we're going to be thinking about how this object got put together. Okay, so somebody has written a title here, but it doesn't completely correspond to the title of the entry that we're getting from the actual library listing, which is actual title Insha Mathuram, which just means like the correspondence of this scribe named Mathuram who lived in the 18th century. To be totally honest, I'm not completely sure what to do with this because it also says and Lachi, who is kind of referred to elsewhere when we look at a note. So I'm wondering if this is a second person whose letters were also included. We can kind of talk about that. Okay, so if we open up here, so I know Kaylee's in the room. I'm not sure how many of you read Perso-Arabic script, but this is in kind of a combination of what we call Nastaliq and Shikasta, which was in 18th and 19th century India among kind of bureaucrats and professional scribes. And that's because you could write faster. So Shikasta actually means broken in Persian, which I find kind of funny because the distinguishing factor is that letters that would normally be separate in Arabic, as in like you don't join them together, can actually be joined together in Shikasta. So it's kind of the opposite of broken. It's actually more joined up. But I think maybe it's called broken because it's like really hard to read. So sometimes I think of this as almost like a doctor's prescription that pharmacists can read, other doctors can read, but it can be hard for a kind of layperson to read because the script has been developed so that they can write really fast. So a few kind of features of that, like this funny little mark here that's kind of like a line that just goes like this. is ke, which is like a Persian construction that just means that. And other things, Shikasta gets very loopy. This page isn't actually super Shikasta-ish, but this kind of loop here is like where you might get two dals, which makes a the sound joined together. Normally they would have to be separated out. So to kind of go from top to bottom, this here I have seen at the top in a few like Indo-Persian letters. And I think again, it was a scribal thing. From what I can gather, it's basically a kind of metonym for the word Allah, which is itself kind of a metonym for what's coming next down here, which is the Bismillah, which just means in the name of God, and will start basically all books that you find written down in the Islamic tradition. And that carries over when you start seeing lithographed prints as well. But it's a kind of way to begin the book. I do not know what these symbols here are. I wish I could be more helpful there, but there are kind of moments throughout this manuscript where I can tell that something is an abbreviation, but I don't have the kind of specialized knowledge to be able to know what that abbreviation is. So that's kind of like a 3-page introduction before we get into the actual beginning of the Insha Mathuram, which is over here. And this, as far as I can tell, was written by a different scribe and is introducing the book. But what's interesting is that they've taken one line from Mathuram's introduction. And the reason that they've taken it is because it's a chronogram. So that I'm talking about this line here. And you can see that what's happened underneath is that they've isolated each of the letters that make up that line, and then they've assigned a numerical value to it. So this actually doesn't make a lot of sense on its own as a line, because the first word is ke, which, as I said, just means that. But I think I was able to find a later print edition that makes it clear that this is the second half of the line where the author, Mathuram, is referring to himself. And he's basically calling himself like from those among the munshiyat or the munshis. And a munshi basically was like a court scribe, so someone who was very learned in Persian. And then he's put his own name here, Mathuram. And what someone has done underneath is isolated each of those letters and just written them out, not in the kind of cursive joined form, but just as a letter. And then done math on how you add these letters together. So within Arabic scribal culture, there's this system called abjad, which basically means that every letter was assigned a kind of conventional numerical value. So often when someone wrote a work, they would have a line that was kind of embedded in there, that if you added it together was the date that they finished the work. And sometimes you also see this on colophons, that scribes will do it for their own work, or you might see it in an illustrated manuscript, that there's another thing signaling the date that they finished the manuscript. So what we've got here is, so this is 11, okay, yeah, this is 1140 in the Hijri calendar. So then you add 622 to that. And can someone help me with the math on that? 1140 plus 622 is 1762. Okay, so that's the date of composition, basically. And what's interesting is when I looked at a later critical edition, they actually got a slightly earlier date, but only by about 8 years. So, and that was due to someone writing, transcribing this word very slightly differently. Kelly, I've just seen your question about, is this language still used for documents? Actually, no. So we'll get into the kind of dates later. This is the date of composition, but this object was actually written and compiled in the 19th century. I think that it was sold in 1865. And I think that's when the annotations stopped. And at that point, Persian had ceased to be a mainstream language of bureaucracy. and of courts in India, because the British administration had decided that it would be English or Urdu. But for many years, Persian was still kind of the court language and the language of administration. So if you had to deal with like a court case, or you had to write a letter to a governor or something like that, you would often have to go to a specialized class of people who knew how to write proper Persian. And this is why a document like this, a kind of collection of letters, would have existed for scribes to kind of be able to communicate with each other according to these templates. And it was often very complicated. Sometimes you read this stuff and it's like, God, this is dramatic. And a lot of British colonial administrators would kind of write, oh, you know, the Persian hyperbole is so hard to understand. And they were kind of interested in getting a different system after they'd been in India for a few decades. Initially, there was actually an enthusiasm to learn Persian from this class of munshis that I've been talking about. Okay, what else did I want to talk about before we move on? Okay, cool. So that is the chronogram. And what's interesting is this introduction that's been added. As far as I can tell, there's a lot of discussion basically about the letters in the words Ali and Muhammad. So Ali being the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law, who's also a very important figure in Islam and in Islamic history. It's often common for people to preface the book by kind of dedicating it to these religious figures. What I find interesting is that this discussion is in here is all based in the kind of idea of letters. So it's talking about like the lam, which is the equivalent of the letter L in Ali, and the dal of Muhammad, and basically using this as a kind of argument that the two are sort of linked. I'm not sure if it's sectarian. You know, I think it might be later that having an association with Ali was specifically a kind of Shia affiliation, but I find it interesting. Okay, so that's this kind of first part here, which just ends in this kind of dedication. And then we get on to the beginning of the work. Here, I think that a former owner has just kind of labeled the different works here and given their dates of composition. So an interesting way about the way that people do dates is that what will normally happen is there's this kind of loop-de-loop form, which is conventionally considered to be a kind of very stylized expression of the word sana, which means year in Arabic. And then there's this little thing here, which is a kind of stylized representation of the first word, first letter of the word Hijri, or migration, which is just the year 0 of the Islamic calendar. So this form here is normally a good indication that you're about to get a date, if the numbers weren't like a great tip off for you. Okay, so here we come to the first page of the work, and what appears to be the case is that I think it's been kind of pasted. And actually, Bran, I just saw your great point about foodways. Yes, there's a really kind of sharp distinction between European engagement with Indian and Indo-Persian culture in the 18th century as you get into the 19th century, and particularly post-1857. So there are Persian manuscripts out there from India where you can see that people have kind of written in English in the margins, and it's clear that they're using it as a kind of vocab exercise, and they're trying to learn proper Persian, just like a reader of this book might have been doing. But after a while, those kinds of objects just aren't found anymore. And it's more about like teaching Indians to learn English rather than adapt the other way around. So I think what's happened here is that the first page of the book has been kind of cut and pasted, if you can see what I mean, because I can feel a seam here to make it fit the dimensions of this book. And I think that's because it's been bound together with a different work, which hopefully you'll see the kind of change in paper when we get there here, which has not been cut at all, as far as I can tell. So it's a little bit tricky for me to tell exactly what happened. If anyone's got any theories here, feel free to write in the chat. But I think what's happened is that the first page of the book has been cut and put onto a different piece of paper to make it fit these new dimensions. And you can kind of tell here because a convention of Perso-Arabic manuscripts is you have what's called a catchword here, which would allow you to reunite the pages if they became separated. So this here corresponds to this up here. Actually, though, now that I'm looking at it, I wonder if there is a missing page because this does not seem to correspond to what's up there, unless it continued. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that you can tell that it's been kind of chopped off here, right? The end of the line hasn't quite made it because it's been cut and then pasted onto the second piece of paper. That hasn't happened on this side, so I'm wondering if it was just this page that was damaged or for whatever reason someone wanted to cut and paste it. But you can see that there is this kind of bit here that I'm thinking might be pasted on. Okay, so here we're seeing a kind of common feature of manuscripts like this, which is what we call rubrications in red. And the red ink is just really being used to allow the reader's eyes to scan the page more easily. And so we haven't really, yes, okay, great. So this is the introduction here. So you can see that the parts that are being highlighted are, okay, so this says Fasle Aval, which is going to be the first chapter. So he's kind of walking the reader through a kind of introduction or table of contents, really. Fasle Dovam, so the second one. And then he's explaining what the different ones here is. So like Fasle Aval, Al-Zabon, Enavob. Okay, so basically the first one is about the words used by this particular Novab or like kind of petty noble. Okay. And so if you're kind of just scanning through with your eyes, you can just tell already that it's giving you the information that you need to know. So then other common words that we'll see rubricated in red. So this here is qitta and this here is fard. So these are referring to different kinds of lines of poetry. And this is a really common feature of this Persian letter writing tradition that this Insha manual is coming out of. You're not just going to write someone a letter in prose because like, that would be rude, especially if you're asking someone for money or you're ordering them to do something. It's always helpful to kind of pad it out with some lines of well-chosen poetry. So this refers to a kind of a fragment. Fard is going to be like, it just means one or individual. So it's just going to be a kind of single line. I'm trying to think of other words that you might see. Sometimes you see ghazal, which is going to be a longer poem. And then these are basically just headings letting you know what kind of writing it is and who it's going to. So this says Arz Dasht, which is a petition, basically like putting forward a request. And you've got other ones as well. So I think there was some that I was seeing earlier that was about birthdays specifically. So on occasions of people's births. Okay, so Bejana Badsha, Shahzada, Muhammad. Okay, so this is just saying who it is. And people had a lot of titles. But basically the idea is that a reader of this manual could kind of go through and find out basically a model template of a letter that they might write for the appropriate occasion and the appropriate kind of stature of a particular person. And these manuals weren't completely hypothetical. It's not that, you know, Madhuram would just kind of sit down and write like fake letters to just go into his manuscript of instruction. These were all taken from things that he actually would have done. So his boss was probably someone kind of at the imperial court, either like in Delhi, if you had a higher job with the Mughal dynasty, or he would have been maybe at a more kind of regional court, serving a noble or a prince. But when he had to kind of go and give people instructions and, you know, write correspondence on behalf of his employers, and he thought, oh man, that was a good letter, then he could copy it over to a work like this. And this is a whole genre, and there are kind of different examples. I did read through the names, trying to figure out if I could see any like prominent personalities that I'm aware of. You know, from the titles, it's clear that He's giving people titles like, this is Bad Shahzada. So that would be like a prince, as in the son of like a great emperor. So it looks like, he's dealing with the kind of upper echelons, but he's not necessarily like in charge of the whole situation. You would see more kind of ornate language, in my opinion, if this were like imperial correspondence, and those are collected in different kinds of manuals. All right, what else did I want to talk about? One thing that I wanted to talk about was a really fun feature of this manuscript, which is the seal impressions. So you see that, actually, you don't see that in this preface on the first 2 pages or in these little later ownership notes. I think they're later because they're in Penn rather than in the reed pen that you get here, that had to be cut a particular way so you get a thicker line. So here is one, and then we also see it at the end of this first work in the bound collection of 2. Here we go. Okay, yeah, so this is the seam. And then you see it at the end here. So this is the colophon, letting you know that this particular copy was made in 1209 Hijri. That's again that distinctive line. And that actually spells out Hijri rather than doing the little stylized representation of the letter H. I wish that I could read this seal better. There's a little number on it that I think is 1238, which would correspond to 1860 in the Gregorian calendar. In terms of the names, I think that I can make out Hussein here, and I think that I can find Abd here, and Abd is going to be followed by ul something, so servant of the, and then normally a name of God. But honestly, I was having a very hard time with this. This is a much more stylized seal impression than I'm used to. And I think that that might be because it's later. The kind of 18th century ones that I've seen have not been as complicated as this. It's really pretty. If you kind of go with a magnifying glass, which is what you need to do to find the teeny tiny date here, you can see that there are these kind of little flowers. Anyway, it's really nice. So we know that this was copied in 1209, which I wrote on my date lineup somewhere. So that's, okay, that's going to be, 1259 is going to be 1843. And then it's bound together with this other work, and we can see the seal is again here. But this one is actually earlier. So if we go to this one's colophon, it is, oh no, it's not here. Oh, why am I having a hard time with this? 130 rectum. Okay. Oh, here we go. It's in red. So it's been rubricated. So this is 1224, which corresponds to 1809. So it's looking like these were 2 separate books, and this latter one, which starts here and ends here. And one of my favorite things about it is that you can tell that the scribe initially felt like he had all this room, was writing really, really big. And by the end, you get the sense that paper was tight and he's a lot more rushed, and there are many more lines per page. And then later in 1843, this other work was written. And then I think that they got bound together. And the question is kind of when this happened. So in terms of what this seal impression tells us, it actually, often people didn't have their seals renewed that often. So we know that this had to be at some point after 1860, but it is quite possible that this was actually, by the time that they were getting around to stamping, it was later. I find it interesting that the stamps are on the first and last pages of the individual works. And that makes me wonder if this person, whose name I can't quite figure out, who had this stamp made in 1860, whether this person maybe originally owned these 2 separate copies, stamped them, and then decided to get them rebound together. Or another possibility is owned these 2 separate copies, stamped them this way as 2 separate copies at the beginning and the end of each individual work, and then someone later bought them individually and then had them bound together. So an interesting thing in kind of trying to trace that out is this note here, that is somebody saying that they bought they bought the manuscript in 1243. And then you see that again, that kind of distinctive date formation, which would be 1865. So that's 5 years after the seal impression. So possibly that person who owned the seal had the book bound up, and then this later person went and bought it and kind of inscribed the date that they bought it. What I would love to know more about is that they've scratched out something here. So sometimes people would put the names of their own names as the owner of a book in this exact place when they noted when they bought it. And it's not uncommon to see that later owners actually scratch that out. So one possibility is that somebody, kind of gave their name in a statement and then later someone came along and scratched it out. It's also possible that this had been an earlier statement that this person scratched out before writing their own statement in 1865. So honestly, it's a little bit tricky to tell what's going on. And the point I'm really trying to make is just that this was clearly a manuscript that had kind of been on a journey, we could say. It went from being 2 different books to being 1, and then it seems to have passed among different hands. So one other thing that I wanted to say, actually, there's another bit of, let me try and find it, but there is a fragment that's been kind of inserted in here that might also tell us something. I have written down where it was, page 105. Oh, and I wanted to say about the page numbers. In the first work, you can see up here that the pages are numbered, but only on this side. That's not the case in the second work, but someone in pencil has gone and done it in, I guess you would say, English numerals, but really these are all Arabic numerals. Okay. So here's this kind of floating bit of paper that I found tucked in. And I think that this paper seems to match pretty well what this paper looks like. There might be people who know more than me in the audience or in the chat. Maybe you can give me your opinions. But if you kind of toggle between the first work and the second, this one is a bit darker and a bit pulpier. And the kind of ley lines are less visible. So I think that looks more like this to me. And I think it's incredibly hard for me to make sense of this, but I think that we're looking at some kind of accounting. So this is very common, this kind of like table formation. And then these I think are numbered. So let me see. I mean, this is definitely 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then that looks like 11. And I'm a little bit less sure what some of these things are doing. And then what's under these kind of normal Arabic numerals is what's called siyak numerals, that were basically, these were kind of based on a very stylized representation of the Arabic full words for particular numbers. And you basically, like, I barely know how to do it at all. But like this, for example, this kind of beginning tells me that we're probably dealing with like 1 decimal place, for example. So I don't know what's going on here, but I felt like it was an interesting window into maybe what else one might have on one's desk while one is composing correspondence, that you might be doing math as well. And this is all kind of part of the world of the petty court secretary who has to have manuals at their disposal. So I've talked a lot. That has taken us to 12:30. If anyone has any burning questions, feel free to write them in the chat. But this has been really fun. Thank you so much for attending.